There are basically two different ways of creating regions in Pro Tools. There's the separate region, and then there is the capture region. So let's talk about separation. By simply putting your edit insertion at a point, and you go in your edit menu, and you can choose to do separate at your selection. Now, the easy way to do this is simply hit the B key, but you can also use the Command E. The difference between these two quick keys is that the B is relying on the keyboard focus that's turned on over here, whereas Command E does not rely on that. So get comfortable with which quick key you want to work with, but I prefer to work with the B key because it's always right there available as a one-key action. Now if you go underneath your Settings menu, you can go into your Preferences. There's a feature in your Edit tab. It's called Auto Name Separated Regions. If this is shut off, then you got an interesting issue. If I highlight this area and I do the B key to separate, it asks me to name it. And it will show up in my regions list as well as my playlist. You can see here, both of them show up. But most engineers and most producers actually prefer to have this feature turned on. That way, anytime they make a separation, Pro Tools automatically creates it. You don't have to worry about it. It just puts a name and a number behind it. So in this case, you can see it added a number 2 behind the region title. Now let's talk about the second method of creating regions. So I'm going to Apple Z this to get back. If I highlight this particular snare, I'll go ahead and solo that. So I want this particular snare sound and I want to capture it and store it for later use. We go underneath the regions menu and we choose capture, and this is Command R. Then you can name this snare capture, for example. And notice it does not create a region in my track. It only creates it in my regions list. Now, in order to find regions that are sorted in this very quickly, what I recommend doing is going into your regions list menu, and you can choose Find. And now we can go in and call it Snare. And you can see that I find the region that's called Snare. And we can now start dragging the snare out and put it in different spots. So let's say I want to put it here, and I also want to put it right there. So let's go ahead and just play this back. So I can really change the order of my loop around very quickly. Let's say I want to put another one right there. So you can see you can very easily lay regions in by rearranging and so forth. Now you could capture a good breath in a vocal so that you may want to replace a bad breath during a recording. You could capture a T or an S in a vocal that sounds more natural. So if you have a vocalist that has overbearing S's, you can sometimes simply just capture a good S and replace the bad S's by using the same process. Very, very powerful way of working with separating and creating regions. So make sure you understand the difference that separate is creating the edit in the track, whereas capture does not. It only puts it in the regions list only. Now let's go ahead and talk about creating more separated points. If I highlight this region right here and go into my edit menu, I can go into what's called separate region on my grid. And when I set it to be a 0 millisecond value for my pre-separate amount, this allows me to create a separated point right at my grid values. And so my grid was set at 16ths. So every 16th has now been cut up. Now let's go ahead and do the same thing, and I'm going to go ahead and choose a little bit different time. So let's set this at 10 milliseconds now. Now if I zoom right in on this, you can see that I have an extra 10 millisecond value of time between here and here. So this allows you to have a little extra time before the actual grid value, in this case right on beat 2. And now I'm going to Apple Z that. Let's zoom out and let's highlight this again. And if I go underneath my edit menu, I can do what's called a separate on transients. And again, I can set this at 0, and every single transient has now been separated to individual parts. This is really, really cool. Very helpful for like percussion, bass, bongos, kits that are very transient in nature. So you're going to find this used a lot in drums specifically. So you could separate all your snares very quickly across the recording, a kick, and so forth. So take advantage of that. But again, you can go in and highlight this and choose to have a different pre amount for my transients. So I could say 10 milliseconds again. And if I highlight this and zoom in a little bit, you can see that it gave me that, again, 10 millisecond value between my transient and the actual separated point.